Morning, 7th graders. Today we're doing digital notes on America as a world power. If you'd rather do notes like on paper and submit pictures of them or scan them into Schoology, that is totally fine too. Okay. So I'm going to go through the slideshow. I'm going to go kind of fast, probably a little bit faster than I typically would, because my recording device only gives me 15 minutes and we have a lot of slides. So these notes are split up between 2 days. So I don't expect you to get all of it done in one day. So don't panic. If you'd rather do it in one day, that's fine too. So you have some choice there. Okay, so we're going to start with talking about imperialism. Okay, so the definition of imperialism: building an empire by founding colonies and conquering other nations. Okay, so kind of an expansion view is what imperialism is. So, for example, when the United States acquired Guam or the Philippines, that was a form of imperialism. Here's a political cartoon that's kind of interesting that shows kind of the U.S. Dominating over some of those other countries. You can see the little kids that look scared. They have like Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba all on their shirts to kind of show the idea that the U.S. thinks they should rule over those countries. Imperialism, why specifically? Countries wanted raw materials, so they wanted specific things that were found in these locations. Businesses wanted new markets for their manufactured goods. Countries thought having colonies was something to be proud of. So they thought if you had more land, more kind of coverage, that was a sign of power. And in your notes, I should have said this before, I highlighted in red kind of the most important things to put down, so that should help you. Isolationism is avoiding involvement in the affairs of other countries, so kind of like staying out of it, okay? So we did that for a short time, and then we did not do that. So here's kind of a short answer question that you can put in your notes. Why would a country like the United States not want to get involved in the affairs of other countries? So there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to that, but asking yourself, what would keep us from staying isolated versus getting involved? Seward's Folly, Secretary of State William Seward purchased Alaska for 2 cents an acre. Okay, people thought he was wasting money. But Alaska ended up being full of valuable natural resources like fur, timber, minerals, and gold. So this was the time when we acquired Alaska, so it was kind of a big deal. But a lot of people at this time were not happy with that. Islands of Samoa and the Hawaiian Islands, which we know are still part of our country now. So those are things that we started to acquire and annex as far as we expanded our imperialist ideology. So this is kind of a cool map that will show you, obviously we know like where some of these things are, but Alaska, Midway, Hawaii, Samoa, Guam, Philippines, things like that kind of shows you like where these things are located to kind of put into perspective. A lot of times we don't look at maps this way a lot of the time with Asia on the left, and people don't realize how close some of these islands actually are to the U.S. because we're used to looking at maps the other way. Sphere of influence, this is kind of a vocab phrase, an area of a nation that is taken control of by a stronger nation in order to control its resources, okay? So, for example, it would be us taking control of Alaska in order to control all the resources in Alaska, okay? So, it's kind of like a sense of just control and then having access to some of those resources. Foreign powers in China. Germany, Great Britain, France, Japan, and Russia, they all controlled areas of China. So that goes back to this sphere of influence. Who had that influence over China? These countries are the ones that did that. The U.S. also wanted equal access to trade with China. Many of the Chinese resented foreign control of their country. They did not like this and were very resistant to this. So this is where we see the Boxer Rebellion come into play. Chinese nationalists rebelled against foreign powers in their country, and they were called the Boxers, and they were the rebellious group. They didn't like the foreign powers in their country, and they were going to kind of rebel. In the 1900s, the Boxers attacked a walled settlement of foreign killing more than 200 people, so we did see a lot of violence come from the Boxer Rebellion. Foreign military forces, including the U.S., defeated the rebellion after a few months. So we put in military troops into China to defeat that group. Another question for your notes: what would it take to make the U.S. step in to help a foreign country in war? Again, think of like this. We joined in defeating the Boxer Rebellion. Why did we do that? Was it in our best interest? Was it because we really wanted equal access to trade with China? That could be. The Spanish-American War, we're going to review all this later on too, so don't freak out if you're feeling like this is a lot of information all at once. It began in 1898. America decided to help the Cuban people who were fighting to win independence from their country from Spain. So Spain had a hold on Cuba, and they wanted to gain their independence. So Americans went to war with the Spanish. The Spanish response was harsh. So Spanish leaders forced many Cubans in the countryside to move to camps under the control of Spanish soldiers. Many of these people died because the camps were not supplied with enough food and things like that. So they were not given the resources that they needed to live. Americans grew more and more concerned as they read what was happening in Cuba and decided to intervene. American business interests in Cuba. So Americans were also concerned about what might happen to American business interests in Cuba if the Spanish did kind of keep this stronghold over Cuba. We owned sugarcane plantations and sugar mills in Cuba, so this was super impactful to us. The USS Maine arrived in Cuba. It was a battleship from the Americans, and it was supposed to be like a friendly visit, they say, but it was intended to show a sign of concern for Americans and American businesses on the island of Cuba. So we were kind of sending a message to Spain, like, we are here, we are concerned about what you're doing, and we may intervene if needed. Well, what happens next is the USS Maine is exploded in February, and it sank in the shallow water of the harbor. Okay, 250 sailors were killed. Nobody knows who was responsible for this attack. Okay, it may have been an accident that just happened on the ship, but many Americans quickly began to blame the Spanish and say that they were responsible for blowing it up. Obviously, the Spanish did not say they did it. They denied it pretty much indefinitely. So there's a picture of it half sunk in the harbor. Yellow journalism fanned the flames. So like I said, people quickly began to blame the Spanish, and they used newspapers and stuff like that. So they used those large attention-grabbing headlines to say that Spanish is responsible for all this awful things. And this sensationalizing was called yellow journalism. So here's an example, a more close-up look at naval officers think the Maine was destroyed by a Spanish mine. So that's kind of one. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. So they start to kind of get people riled up about who was responsible. The Spanish-American War begins. So that was the tipping point for us to start war with the Spanish. We declared war on each other in the spring of 1898, and the first action came in the Philippines. Okay. The Philippines also were controlled by Spain. American ships attacked Spanish Navy ships located in the Philippines and quickly destroyed them, so we kind of sent a message right away. Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders became famous during this time. The fighting in Cuba began in the summer and was over by the end of August. The drawings here shows Theodore Roosevelt leading his Rough Riders in one of the battles, and we know that he eventually becomes president. Images like this one left the impression that Roosevelt was a bold and talented leader. He returned to the U.S. as a war hero, and only a few years later, he was elected VP. Not long after that, he became president of the U.S. because President McKinley was assassinated. The result of the Spanish-American War, Cuba did become an independent country, so that was good. The U.S. helped the country set up a new government, but we also let them know that we would intervene in their kind of country affairs if necessary. So we didn't control Cuba. We allowed them to stay an independent country, but we did say we're going to intervene if we need to. The peace treaty with Spain gave the U.S. control of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, so we expanded our territories in that way. And the United States was now seen as a world power. So we basically showed the rest of the world, hey, we have expanded our territory. We're not going to let people kind of mess with us. This was like a way for us to expand that view to the rest of the world. Part 3 was a new plan in Latin America. Okay. The U.S. wanted a canal across Panama to save shipping time and money because if you think about it, when they shipped things, they had to go all the way around South America because there was no way through. So they wanted to build a canal right here in Panama to save the time of going around that whole continent of South America, which made a lot of sense. So 48 miles across Panama was the canal that was built. Here are some pictures of that being done. Panama becomes a country, so it was part of Colombia originally, and Colombia was not a fan of us building a canal, okay, so Panama became its own country. President Roosevelt learned that Panamanians, I always say that wrong, were planning a revolt against Colombia to gain independence, so they wanted to have their independence anyway. So the U.S. sent a warship to block Colombian ships from stopping a revolt in Panama. 6,000 lives were lost building the Panama Canal to disease and accidents. If you think about the time period that we're in, they did not have like the safety restrictions, and they didn't have necessarily the materials that we have now if we were going to build a canal in 2020. So a lot of people lost their lives while building the canal. International police power of the United States. Many Latin American countries owed money to European countries. Roosevelt insisted that these countries repay their debts, basically because he didn't want the Europeans coming over to collect them. He didn't want to risk us losing power in Latin America, and he didn't want the European countries coming in and trying to gain power of certain parts of Latin America. So he demanded that the Latin American countries repay their debts to the European countries. And then there was a decision on how the U.S. should deal with Latin America. Okay, so Roosevelt used police power to keep Latin American nations in line, and then Taft used dollar diplomacy, used money to influence foreign governments instead of force. Okay, so he, instead of using police or actual people to hold it in force, he used money to kind of influence how they did things. Wilson believed the U.S. should protect democracy in Latin America. This was the time of the Mexican Revolution. He wanted to help stop it to protect American business interests in Mexico. So what you will see kind of throughout our history with countries in South America and in the Caribbean is we are always kind of focused on our own business interests in these countries, and that's kind of where our decision comes to either occupy or help or control or whatever it is. It's always about America. I guess you could argue that with Cuba, we did help them get their independence. But like this slide shows, American business interests in Cuba. That was kind of the reason that we did that, is because we had a business interest there. So I hope that was helpful. I hope your notes went well. Remember, the red is kind of what you're putting in your notes. It's the most important things. And then these questions you can be answering on the side of your notes. And you can either submit that in Schoology, or if you did paper notes, you can take pictures or scan them into Schoology, and that is fine as well. Happy learning.